Athens gave the world democracy. It gave the world philosophy. It gave the world the very idea that a human being has rights simply by existing. And yet, inside the same city, walking the same streets, breathing the same air as Socrates and Plato, there lived a group of women who had almost none of that. Not citizenship, not protection under the law, not even ownership of their own bodies. Today we're going to look at exactly what daily life meant for these women, the domestic slaves of classical Athens, using what historians have pieced together from court speeches, philosophical texts, and legal records that have survived for over 2,000 years. Some of what you're about to hear is so strange, so contradictory to everything Athens claimed to represent, that many people who study ancient Greece for years never actually encounter it, because it's buried in legal footnotes and comic plays rather than the famous philosophy everyone reads in school. And here's the detail that makes this story different from most ancient history you've heard. This wasn't hidden. It wasn't a scandal whispered about in back rooms. It was written down, openly, matter-of-factly, by the very people running the system, because to them, none of it needed to be secret at all. Let's start with where these women actually lived, because the setting explains almost everything that follows. The Greeks called a household an oikos. It's a word that sounds simple, almost cozy, but it meant something closer to a self-contained miniature economy. One roof covering agriculture, craft production, childcare, and labor, all under the total command of one man, the Kyrios. Every decision inside that household, who ate, who worked, who married, who was punished, ran through him. Now here's a number that catches most people off guard. Historians estimate that in classical Athens, somewhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 2 people living in the city may have been enslaved. Read that again. In the city remembered for inventing citizen democracy, a huge portion of the actual population had no vote, no voice, and no legal existence as a person at all. Female domestic slaves were everywhere inside the system, spinning wool, grinding grain by hand for hours every day, nursing infants, cooking, cleaning, managing the endless physical labor that kept an Athenian household running. The philosopher Xenophon actually wrote a how-to manual for husbands called the Oikonomicus, and inside it he coaches Athenian men on how to train, organize, and manage their household slaves almost exactly the way you'd manage tools in a workshop. Efficient, detached, practical. But here's where the story takes its first unsettling turn. Male slaves in Athens mostly worked outside the home, in the fields, the silver mines, the workshops, far from the master's daily reach. Female slaves worked inside, every day, in constant physical proximity to the master and his entire family. And Athenian law drew almost no boundary at all around what that proximity could mean. An enslaved woman in Athens had no legal right to refuse her master. Nothing in the law protected her from being used for domestic labor by day, and treated as something else entirely once the household went quiet at night. Historians studying the surviving legal speeches of the period, particularly the orator Demosthenes, have found something genuinely chilling. Case after case where this kind of access to slave women is mentioned almost casually as background detail, not as the point of the dispute. As if everyone reading it already understood this was simply how households worked. There was even an official term for one specific arrangement, the pallake, often translated as concubine. She wasn't a wife. She had no inheritance rights, no legal protection, no say in her own future. But she could be, and very often was, a slave woman kept in this role for years, sometimes bearing children who then existed in a strange legal gray zone themselves, neither fully free nor fully claimed. And this detail is what really stops people in their tracks. This wasn't whispered about in secret. It shows up openly, in courtroom speeches, in comic theater performed in front of thousands of citizens, in philosophical texts meant to be read by respected men of the city. Nobody was hiding it because nobody in power saw a reason to. Which raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with for a second. What does it mean when the most disturbing part of a system isn't that it was secret, but that it wasn't? Now here's where the story shifts from disturbing into something almost hard to believe. Because Athenian law didn't just permit control over an enslaved woman's body. In the courtroom, it legally required it. If an enslaved person's testimony was needed as evidence in an Athenian trial, the law did not allow them to simply speak the way a free citizen could. Their words were only considered legitimate if they were extracted through torture, a formal legal procedure called basanos. The reasoning Athenian citizens genuinely believed was this: a slave's word given freely could never be trusted. But somehow, a slave's word given under extreme physical suffering could. Surviving legal speeches show lawyers actually proposing, in open court, to torture the opposing side's slaves as a method for getting to the truth, and sometimes the other side would refuse, not because torture itself was considered wrong, but because refusing was a legal chess move, since a jury might read that refusal as a sign of guilt. Think about what that legal system actually built into itself. An enslaved woman's body wasn't just controlled in daily household life. It was formally defined in the eyes of the law as an object that only produced truth when subjected to pain, not a witness, evidence. Historians still debate today how often basanos was actually carried out versus simply threatened as a courtroom tactic. But even as a threat, even as a legal possibility written into the system, it tells you everything about where these women stood in Athenian society. And this brings us to perhaps the most haunting part of the entire story: the silence that followed. We know the names of Athenian generals. We know the names of playwrights, philosophers, even famous courtesans who moved through elite social circles and left records of their wit and influence. But the ordinary domestic slave woman, the one grinding grain in the back room of an unremarkable citizen's house, left almost nothing behind. No inscriptions bearing her name. No letters. In most cases, not even a gravestone. Archaeologists have found small, scattered clues, occasional grave markers referring simply to nurse or wet nurse, sometimes with language suggesting genuine affection from the family that had owned her, which is itself an unsettling contradiction to sit with. A household could clearly value a woman personally, even feel something like fondness for her, while still holding complete legal power over her body and her entire future. Some historians have tried piecing together fragments of these lives through indirect evidence: vase paintings showing women working at a loom with an enslaved attendant standing quietly nearby, comic plays where a slave woman's mistreatment is casually played for laughs by the audience, funeral reliefs hinting at decades of service inside a single family. But there is no autobiography, no first-person account, no diary. The entire historical record of these women's lives was written exclusively by the people who owned them, which means everything we know is filtered, and everything we don't know may be the larger, more important part of the story. And this is exactly what makes ancient Athens such a strange, almost contradictory case study for historians today. This is the city that produced Socrates, a man who spent his entire life publicly asking, "What is justice?" It's the birthplace of democratic government, where free male citizens gathered in the open air of the Nix Hill to debate laws that would shape the future of the city. It's the home of Greek tragedy, plays exploring suffering, fate, and human dignity with a depth that still moves audiences 25 centuries later. And within walking distance of that same debate, that same open-air theater, that same philosophy, enslaved women lived with no legal personhood whatsoever, their bodies subject to their owner's will as a plain, unquestioned fact of daily existence, not an exception to the system, not a scandal within it, the system itself. Historians are careful to point out that this wasn't uniquely Athenian cruelty. Slavery structured around this kind of control existed across many ancient societies, from Rome to the wider ancient Near East. What makes Athens such a heavily studied case is simply the sheer volume of surviving written evidence, legal speeches, philosophy, comic theater, that lets modern historians reconstruct, in unusually specific detail, exactly how normalized all of it had become. So the next time you hear Athens described as the birthplace of freedom and human dignity, it's worth pausing on what that freedom was actually built on top of, and precisely who was left out of it entirely. Behind the marble columns, behind the philosophical debates that still shape how we think today, there was another Athens running quietly underneath it all. One with no name, no voice, and almost no trace left in the historical record at all. If uncovering these buried, overlooked corners of ancient history is the kind of thing that keeps you curious, subscribe, because there are far more stories like this one still sitting untranslated in sources most people never think to look at.